Hello, good evening, and welcome to Novara Live. I'm Bastani. I'll be joined a little bit later on by Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. Coming up tonight, more on Donald Trump's trade war and what it means for British industry, particularly our car manufacturers. And Israel has killed yet another journalist in Gaza. Stay tuned for all of that. But before we get started, I'd like to remind you that we are currently hiring here at Novara Media. We're looking for an additional live stream producer to join our team and help us expand the production. That's 4 days a week. The ideal candidate would have demonstrable experience in live broadcasting environments, as well as strong knowledge of left-wing politics and current affairs. That certainly wouldn't hurt. To find out more, please go to the link in the description below. And of course, as ever, make sure to let us know what you think using the comments in the YouTube chat or just tweeting at us or at me on the hashtag Novara Live. Finally, if you'd like to support our work here at Novara Media, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. Again, the link is in the description below. Help us build a people-powered media. First story. The world's two biggest economies are on a collision course for a full-blown trade war. US President Donald Trump has threatened to impose a further 50% tariff on China. That's if China doesn't back down and withdraw its reciprocal 35% tariff by the end of the day. Here's what Trump wrote on his Truth Social platform yesterday. If China does not withdraw its 34% increase above their already long-term trading abuses by tomorrow, April 8, 2025, the United States will impose additional tariffs on China of 50% effective April 9th. Additionally, all talks with China concerning their requested meetings with us will be terminated. But China appears to be unbowed. Here's a representative of the country's foreign ministry speaking at a press conference today.
The U.S. abuse of tariffs seriously infringes upon the legitimate rights and interests of countries, violates WTO rules, hurts the rules-based multilateral trading system, and destabilizes global economic order. It is a typical move of unilateralism, protectionism, and economic bullying. It is rejected by the whole international community. China strongly deplores and firmly opposes this. Let me stress once again that trade wars and tariff wars have no winners, and protectionism has no way out. The Chinese people never create trouble, neither do we fear trouble. Pressuring, threatening, or extorting China is not the right way to engage with us. China will do what is necessary to firmly safeguard our legitimate and lawful rights and interests.
In terms of the Asian markets, here's the Nikkei 225 so far this year. That's the 225 largest publicly listed companies in Japan. It's like the FTSE 100 in the UK. As you can see, the index was hovering at around the 40,000 mark at the start of the year, but then it went below 32,000 on the Trump tariff news, more than a 20% drop. That's a lot of lost value. It's recently started to recover, however. That's something you can also see at the bottom there with the Hang Seng Index and the Sensex, which are respectively Hong Kong and Indian indexes, the Sensex being the benchmark index of the Bombay Stock Exchange, hence BSE. I think it's around 30 firms. So China is taking a strong stance, and Asian markets have appeared to stabilize today after a mass stock sell-off. Nevertheless, Scott Bessent, US Treasury Secretary, assured CNBC viewers that China would ultimately lose out.
Many of our trading partners, they have queued up and they have kept their cool. They have not escalated, and they will get priority in the queue. I think it was a big mistake, this Chinese escalation, because they're playing with a pair of twos. Traditionally, if you look at the history of the trade negotiations, we are the deficit country. So what do we lose by the Chinese raising tariffs on us? We export 1/5 to them of what they export to us. So that is a losing hand for them.
I don't think that's going to be music to the ears of the likes of Apple or Tesla. European and US markets also saw stocks rally after Trump's tariffs initially plunged global markets into chaos. Investors are hopeful that trade agreements can be completed to remove or at least mitigate those tariffs, but they may be a little too optimistic. Here's Trump's trade representative, Jameson Greer, being asked when the tariffs will start.
Senator, yes, they're scheduled to go into effect. We are having negotiations with all kinds of countries at this time. The president's fixed in his purpose. The nature of the emergency that I discussed earlier is not something we can wait on anymore. So we will have the president's plan go into effect, and we're coupling that with immediate negotiations with our partners as they seek to...
So it's not a question of something being scheduled. You're committing this morning that they're going to go into effect.
This is what the president has said, Senator.
For how many countries? I understand it's over 50.
That are negotiating with us. We have about 50 that have come to speak with us.
Greer added there was no timeline for negotiations to be completed and that Trump doesn't plan to have exclusions or exemptions. Over $6 trillion had already been wiped off the value of US stocks as of yesterday, with the president describing the market pain as a dose of, quote, medicine. The idea being that to fix Main Street, you need to hurt Wall Street. Naturally, many of Trump's billionaire backers are less than pleased about the tanking of the US stock market. After all, during the last presidency, the stock market soared, and they basically expected the same to happen again this time. Presumably, they thought the whole reindustrialization thing was just PR. Now, we played this clip yesterday, but I want to show it to you again. That's because it's useful in understanding where Trump's billionaire backers were on this stuff just a few months ago. This is Bill Ackman speaking to Fox News. Like I say, a few months ago, he was a major Trump backer and is the CEO of Pershing Capital Management.
We're stepping into, I would say, the most pro-growth, pro-business, pro-American administration I've perhaps seen in my adult lifetime, certainly. We just had a nice little ceremony and CEOs of broad array of big American companies, and I would say everyone is incredibly enthusiastic, really about a new administration that's about efficiency, removing the impediments to growth, deregulation.
But oh, how the times have changed. Because America's gilded elite have been flummoxed by these tariffs. This wasn't the plan. You're not meant to do the things you say as a politician. It's just meant to be a window dressing. Among those with major reservations about the shift on trade is the world's richest man and thin-skinned space Karen Elon Musk. The Washington Post reports that Musk spent last weekend trying, ultimately in vain, to persuade Trump to roll back his aggressive tariff plan in private while publicly laying into White House trade advisor Peter Novara, otherwise known as my PT, to Donald Trump. But Musk took aim at Novara's credentials. He's not a fan, posting this on X. A PhD in econ from Harvard is a bad thing, not a good thing. Results in the ego/brains greater than one problem. I have no idea what that means, but it is true that credentials don't necessarily mean intelligence. And Novara nevertheless hit back with his own assessment of the Tesla CEO.
When it comes to tariffs and trade, we all understand in the White House, and the American people understand, that Elon's a car manufacturer. But he's not a car manufacturer. He's a car assembler in many cases. If you go to his Texas plant, a good part of the engines that he gets, which in the EV case is the batteries, come from Japan and come from China. The electronics come from Taiwan. The tires come. What we want, and the difference is in our thinking and Elon's on this, is that we want the tires made in Akron. We want the transmissions made in Indianapolis. We want the engines made in Flint and Saginaw, and we want the cars manufactured here.
Elon Musk then responded with this. Navarro is truly a moron. What he says here is demonstrably false. In fact, Elon Musk doesn't seem to remotely align with the Navarro and Trump agenda. We saw that with his support for H-1B1 visas a few months ago, but it's especially glaring in this next clip you're about to see. It's from Saturday night when Musk addressed the League Congress online. That's an event hosted by right-wing Italian Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini.
I hope it is agreed that both Europe and the United States should move, ideally, in my view, to a zero tariff situation, effectively creating a free trade zone between Europe and North America. And that would be that's what I hope occurs. And also more freedom of people to move between Europe and North America, if they wish. If they wish to work in Europe or wish to work in America, they should be allowed to do so, in my view. So that has certainly been my advice to the president.
What did he think he was getting? Donald Trump wants low immigration and high tariffs. Elon Musk wants low tariffs or no tariffs and high immigration. Did he back a politician and an agenda purely on the basis of opposition to woke? How badly is this going to hit his own bottom line? Because as Peter Novara said, rightly, by the way, huge parts of Tesla's supply chains, SpaceX's too, any industrial company in the United States, huge parts of their supply chains are based outside of the country. Huge parts. So massive pain is on the way for every single major industrial actor in the US, in the short to medium term. Nobody's saying otherwise, by the way. What did he think was going to happen? Apparently, Make America Great Again means a free trade area, including not just North America, which is NAFTA, and of course Trump hated NAFTA, but no, we're going to expand NAFTA to include the European Union too. It's wild. Now, this marks the highest profile disagreement so far between Trump and one of his key advisors. It also comes after reports last week that Musk will step down from his federal budget slashing role with Doge when the 130-day cap on his government service expires. Insiders said Musk would be stepping down from his lead role despite earlier claims from the White House that Musk would be, quote, here to stay. Helena, that clip I showed our audience a few moments ago, utterly extraordinary, isn't it? It's like he thinks he backed a different politician, I guess, or was it all just vibes?
I mean, I pretty much agree with your assessment that Elon Musk essentially backed Trump because he didn't like woke. I mean, he literally tweets about it daily. He said the woke mind virus will die because it took my son away from me. Like, it's the craziest thing. The man's brain's basically been broken by Twitter. Because you're right in saying that he does want this kind of neoliberal trade bloc that includes the European Union and America and a bunch of North American states as well. Because fundamentally, a lot of his radicalization that got him into right-wing circles, it wasn't actually this kind of woke, anti-woke stuff, but that is more of a new thing as far as Elon Musk is concerned, that radicalized him towards Trumpism rather than kind of Trump's economic policy, what he represents to like the MAGA base in America. His real kind of move away from the left is the trade unionists. This is in 2017 time. His Tesla plant in Sweden has had a very, very long, multi-year, protracted dispute with IF Metall, which is the largest automotive union in Sweden. And essentially, he's been at war with the European model of wage labor bargaining ever since. We remember in his original pivot away from the Democrats towards the Republicans, he originally said, oh, well, the Democrats are now the party of the trade unions and the class action lawyers. That's who his enemy really was at the time, was why he pivoted away and became more of a political independent. And then his obsession with anti-woke politics is what drove him towards Trump. But the reason why he wants this big kind of multilateral agreement is so that he can get wage arbitrage between plants in the EU and plants in America. There's obviously a much worse labor movement in terms of its size in America. The labor laws are worse. There's right-to-work states in America. We've got the Taft-Hartley Act that killed trade unionism for a very long time in the United States, which in the European Union, there's far less of that. There are much more trade unions, there's much more bargaining rights for workers in the EU. So being able to get that wage arbitrage, he'd be able to win that kind of fight with the trade unionists that he currently has with the Tesla plant in Sweden. That was his whole thing. It was his whole economic policy. It seems like he just didn't pay attention to what America was doing or what Trump wanted to do at the time. Because if you really wanted to look at a way of prioritizing industrial strategy in the United States, well, that's what Joe Biden was doing. He was putting tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles to maintain the productive capacity for electric vehicles within the United States, where Tesla has some productive capacity there, and not attacking the European Union on this. And then on top of this, they were putting huge amounts of fiscal stimulus into the industrial sector in America to be able to do that. And we have the comparison to the EU at the moment, where they've had this kind of austerity drive for, decades and decades, abandoning industrial policy for so long, that the real industrial policy was always actually coming from the Biden administration, that there was the kind of real sweet spot between this kind of tariff nuke that's been dropped by Trump and this international free trade wage arbitrage model that Elon Musk really supports in his head. But of course, once you've had your brain broken by being a fervently anti-woke culture warrior, any amount of rational explanation is something that will completely go over your head. So that's why I think that Elon Musk is in the Trump camp, even though it's really not in his best economic interests. I would also like to make a point from that segment about the trade war with China too. And at the end of it, I think that China will end up being successful in this, because at the end of the day, it's about how many friends you have. And when it comes to the model, the international geopolitical model that America has, this comprador capitalism model, where you actually are very kind of belligerent in terms of how you treat the global south. You impose leaders that are amenable to your interests, but not the local population, and you use that to be able to control a neocolonial pipeline of resources. That may be good in the short term, and as long as you have those leaders in place, that will work. But China's done the opposite. China has Belt and Road. China's been building infrastructure. China's been making friends in the global south. And when the chips fall at the end of the global trade war, it's the people with the most friends that are going to win, the people with the most influence geopolitically. And at a time when the Trump campaign is making enemies of everybody, I think that that's going to play into China's hands in the long term.
Yeah, I think there's some really wise words there. I'd also add, by the way, if the United States wants to reindustrialize, it can't just do that with tariffs. You're dealing with major businesses. Take Apple as one example. They've just been using years of prodigious growth and expansion to basically fund share buybacks for shareholders, right? Rather than actually investing in productive capacity. And all of a sudden, you're basically saying, we're going to do a whole different kind of capitalism now, guys. If you want to do that, you're going to have massive coordination, centralization, a significant role for the state. Bear in mind that many of these major Chinese firms have state backing, or they're state-owned, or the state has major equity shares in them. What Trump is proposing kind of never happened before, right? It's kind of never happened before. And remember, he gave Trump, Elon Musk that is, he gave Trump $250 million, more or less, to get him over the line in the last presidential election. And I think you're right. It was just on the woke stuff. It was just on the woke stuff. This does not make sense for Elon Musk from a business perspective. He was very much out there on H-1B1 visas. Bannon hates the guy. Because when it comes to political economy, industrial policy, the whole MAGA agenda, they're on completely different sides of the ideological spectrum. Last year, the UK produced around 900,000 cars. While it's not one of the largest car manufacturers in the world, China holds that title, producing 30 million vehicles in 2023, with the United States in second place with 10 million. The industry is nevertheless of major importance to the UK economy. It employs around 190,000 people. What is more, it's the country's leading export when it comes to goods, an area where the UK otherwise struggles, with more than 65% of all cars made here destined for abroad. While most of those cars are destined for Europe, at least 10%, around 75,000 cars, went to the US in 2023. And as of this week, those vehicles are now subject to a 35% tariff, 25% being the baseline for all car imports to the US, with an additional 10% tariff, of course, for the UK. Remember, this is meant to be a benefit of Brexit, only 35% tariffs. As a result, Jaguar Land Rover have already suspended exports of vehicles to the US. Others could follow. And this is the most obvious challenge with Trump's new tariffs. But besides higher barriers to entering the US market, there's also the issue of price deflation in Europe. And remember, 60% of UK car exports are to the European Union. In theory, the new tariff should make certain goods more expensive for American consumers because of a decrease in supply, and less expensive for everyone else because of an increase in supply, oversupply. Japanese, Chinese, and European cars, which might previously have been headed across the Atlantic, now won't be, which means a lower price for consumers here in Europe, at least for now, but a major hit to manufacturers who will see their margins either reduce or disappear. Really interesting. As we reported yesterday, Keir Starmer responded to those new tariffs by softening the implementation of rules around electric vehicle purchases. Luxury brands like McLaren will be able to sell petrol cars after 2030, while fines and targets are being softened across the industry ahead of and during that shift beyond petrol cars. But is that anywhere near enough? In this challenging moment, I wanted to speak to someone with expert knowledge of the sector from the position of workers. So earlier today, I spoke to Ben Norman. He's a researcher for Unite the Union. I started by asking Ben about the immediate impact of the tariffs on Britain's embattled car industry.
Well, embattled is the word. These tariffs couldn't have come at a worse time. At the moment is a perfect storm facing the automotive industry. Several different things coming together, the end result of which is a historic low volume crisis. Production in the UK car industry is now lower than it has been since the 1950s, lower even than during the COVID pandemic. And this is just going to be another hit on top of the hits that have kept on coming. So, in terms of sort of facts and stats, the US is a significant export partner. The majority of UK vehicles made here are exported. So it's a big chunk. It's about 16% of vehicles. And that's higher in the premium part of the market. So that's Aston Martin, Rolls-Royce, Bentley. For them, it's about 25% of the vehicles they make go to the US. So it's a significant chunk of production that could be lost. And that obviously has an immediate impact on the workforce. It makes jobs far more precarious. The industry is built for high volume. We're already facing low volume before the tariffs kicked in. If we're now talking about potentially losing even more volume, even more export, and some of the big OEMs, the car plants, have talked about pausing exports to the US temporarily, that's only going to make jobs more precarious. Overall, different studies say different things, but the maximum number would be about 25,000 jobs at risk, predominantly in the West Mids, the Northwest, but other regions as well.
And yesterday, Labour announced changes to EV rules in response to those tariffs. So high-value manufacturers like McLaren, for instance, can continue to make petrol cars after the 2030 ban. Some fines and targets are being softened, basically, for everyone else. Will those changes make a difference?
We're not confident it will. Yesterday we saw Keir Starmer in one of our main car plants in the UK talking about British cars for British workers. And it's very nice that he's whipped into patriotic fervour by saying, the world-class facilities that we have in the automotive sector. But the reality is, we'd have far more confidence if he stopped waving the flag and actually started waving an industrial strategy, give us a plan to defend jobs in the automotive sector. That's got to be through this period of low volumes, which could go on for a couple of years, and it's got to get us through some of these big challenges. But it's also got to answer some big questions about which direction the automotive sector is going. Will we continue to have big volume production that sustains hundreds of thousands of jobs? Will we be going into new technologies? Will we be going into other areas? How are we going to tackle Chinese imports? There's some big fundamental questions. Flag-waving rhetoric by itself isn't going to answer those questions.
Sticking on China, because that's really, really interesting, Ben. BYD recently saw their market capitalization surpass 100 billion. They are very much coming for the lunch of European and, in the case of Tesla, American automotive manufacturers. Obviously, these tariffs from the US are hurting your members in the UK, but would you favour something like tariffs as well to defend their jobs, given the challenge now posed by Chinese exports of EVs in particular?
China is absolutely one of the biggest challenges. Before the tariffs came up, if you'd have asked me what the single biggest challenge would have been, China would have been up there. And that's fundamentally a challenge for the parts of the industry which are for mass market. At the moment, China is able to come in, and the claim is that they can undercut at the point of production, and therefore cars are cheaper, and therefore it's going to increase the market share in what historically is the affordable part of the car market. The problem is we don't fundamentally accept the argument that the UK and the European Union, or the United States, or the West, as it were, can't make affordable electric vehicles. That's fundamentally the crux of all of this. The problem, and again, coming back to the tariffs, or it's coming back to the emissions targets, why is the electric vehicle market not increasing? Why is it stalled, both here and in Europe? Fundamentally, it's because people can't afford them. We're in a cost of living crisis. People cannot afford electric vehicles where the price is going ever and ever higher. So we need to see action whereby prices come down and barriers to demand are removed. At the same time, people's electricity bills are going up. The idea that people are going to then be plugging in electric vehicles into, through their letterboxes or windows if you live in a terrace street or wherever else. Energy isn't affordable. It's not accessible. EV prices are too high. These are the fundamental structural questions that need to be answered by an industrial strategy. Now, don't forget, when we talk about the emissions targets, which are really about the ZEV mandate, the zero emission vehicles mandate, it's not really a response to the tariffs. What the government have got here is they have still inherited these targets from the previous government. The 2030 ban on ICE, which is internal combustion engine vehicles, petrol and diesel, that was unilaterally announced by Michael Gove. That was a Tory policy. And what we said back at the time, and what academic experts who work closely with us have said, that 2030 is a great ambition to have, but it's a moonshot. If you want to achieve a moonshot, you need a NASA. NASA means having a plan. We don't currently have a plan. So our concern is, we need to see a plan forthcoming very, very quickly, which is going to defend jobs in all of the car plants and in the supply chain. And if we don't think that's going to happen by 2030, then we need to go back to 2035, in line with Europe, in line with the investment cycles of the industry as they are. And we need to see a longer term plan that helps to save jobs. And we need an industrial strategy which says, what's the fundamental direction the UK automotive sector is going to go in. And once again, as it stands, those questions remain absolutely unanswered.
That's really illuminating. So Keir Starmer is offering something there, but it's not sufficient when it comes to industrial strategy, but also, from the sounds of it, basic infrastructure. I mean, I live in Portsmouth. You've got terraces galore. The idea that the state isn't going to be central in creating the kind of infrastructure we need for mass adoption of EVs is for the birds, and yet they're not doing anything. I've got a question about COVID. How have things changed for the automotive industry in this country since COVID? And were things going back to normal before these tariffs, or is normal for car manufacturing in this country kind of gone for good?
Well, I mean, the reality is there's never been a normal in the automotive sector, which is why trade changes to trade hit us so much. The automotive sector is fundamentally structured around neoliberal trade. It's very much structured around foreign direct investment and the neoliberal structure of the economy. So it's very, very sensitive to market changes. It's the canary down the mine in terms of any time there's big structural changes to the economy or challenges to the economy. But I think there's probably two parts to it. On the one hand, volume has really been going down dramatically across the sector since 2015 onwards. Back in 2015, we were on the route towards almost achieving that 2 million mark in terms of the amount of vehicles produced in this country. By this point, as of 2024, we're at just over 900,000. So we've seen effectively a half in terms of the production in terms of UK vehicles. That's had an impact on jobs. The fundamental question is, are we going to see any sort of plan to increase volumes back to where they were, to sustain the current jobs we've got, to sustain more jobs? As it stands, again, we're not seeing that. So again, big choices have got to be made. Is the ambition to get back up to that, or is it to sustain where we currently are? Again, significant questions.
My final question is a response to that, really. I mean, that's an extraordinary statistic, isn't it? More than halving of automotive production in this country, from almost 2 million to under 1 million. And I suppose we've talked about the tariffs, we've talked about COVID, then of course there's Brexit, cost of living crisis, as you mentioned a few moments ago, with regards to consumers' ability to buy these cars that are being manufactured by UK workers. Challenge after challenge after challenge, job losses, precarity, and so on. Of course, this isn't a set of circumstances just facing UK car workers. We see it across Europe, in Germany. And there in Germany, the AfD have had a campaign called Zentrum Automobil, where they're trying to radicalize car workers towards the far right. Now, we have a very different setup in this country. There aren't workers' councils, unfortunately, where political games and campaigns can be played in the same way. But I wonder, there's the national polling for reform, Labour losing a ton of support. In your view, where politically are the shop floors of where your members are based? I know you can't generalise, but maybe you can add some colour in terms of political sentiments right now amongst UK car workers.
It's a huge concern. So as you've touched on the situation in Germany, I would say that we don't see the far right acting the similar sort of strategy here in the same organised way. But we are seeing the conditions are absolutely perfect for that sort of intervention to start coming in. One of the big issues that we learned, we've had a lot of dialogue with our counterparts in Germany, e.g. Mattel, who developed a good strategy for dealing with this. When we've had recent delegations there and discussing with them, one of the things they've picked up on is that what AfD did was they talked a lot about deindustrialization, and a little bit like reform here, they talked a lot about deindustrialization versus net zero, trying to demonize net zero. And what the sort of centre left ended up doing is they ended up retreating from any talk about deindustrialization because they believed that was engaging the far right in some sort of debate. And in reality, it meant that the far right were only people talking about deindustrialization, which is a fundamental risk. We're talking about the sorts of production figures in the UK. It's been absolutely parlous in Germany when we've seen huge amounts of job cuts announced at VW, plant closures at Ford. When only AFD are coming forward and talk about deindustrialization, obviously that's gonna get an echo. At the moment, we've just seen the closure of the Luton van plant up at Vauxhall Luton. That's 1,100 jobs gone. That's only happened a couple of weeks ago. And it's a grim irony, in fact, that one of the changes that Keir Starmer's just announced is that you can now buy diesel and petrol vans to 2035. We've just lost the only van plant that produced diesel and petrol vans. The only van plant we now have, the surviving one, only produces EVs. So there's some grim irony there in terms of the disconnect between policy and what's happening on the ground. But the case of Luton is important because Luton is obviously the home of the EDL, of Tommy Robinson, of Andrew Tate, of all of these horrendous figures. And it's absolutely clear that when we lose a plant like Luton, in a community like Luton, when all the conditions are there and the impact of deindustrialization is going to be so brutal on that sort of community, you're inevitably going to see an increase of support amongst people who are prepared to take that up. So for us, as trade unionists, we need to be very, very strong in coming out against that. We need to be very, very strong in talking about the challenges that are facing workers. Why is work being more made precarious? Why is it if you do manage to have your job, it's made harder? Why is work becoming more and more intensive, even though in some cases production's going down? There's some fundamental challenges for people in UK industries. And at the same time, people are seeing the headlines around them. We're seeing a crisis in the steel industry. We're seeing a crisis up at Grangemouth with refinery workers. Automotive workers are seeing these historic lows of production and are fearing that they're next. And we've got to have a very clear answer to that. And again, it's always going to come down to, well, what's the plan? What's the immediate support that could be put in place in order to defend jobs now? And then what's the plan looking towards 2030, 2035, so we can meet any sort of climate targets, but also, make sure that it's a sustainable industry which creates and defends hundreds of thousands of jobs. Like, those two things shouldn't be in conflict, right?
That was Ben Norman from Unite the Union speaking to me earlier today. Staying with British industry, British steel manufacturing is facing perhaps its darkest moment in living memory. Trump has slapped 25% tariffs on the UK steel and aluminium exports, plus, of course, the 10% on all British imports to the US. And the Chinese-owned British steel plant in Scunthorpe has launched a consultation on the proposed closure of the facility. It is the last remaining steelmaker in Britain, and thousands of jobs are at risk. So which party leader was at the Scunthorpe plant calling for British steel to be renationalised today? I'll give you three guesses. And no, it wasn't the Prime Minister and leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer. It was this guy, Nigel Farage. He bagged a photo op in front of a blast furnace, brandishing, get this, Unite GMB literature. Utterly extraordinary. Two Labour-affiliated trade unions, industrial mammoths when it comes to organised labour in this country, if such a thing still exists. Certainly the case with Unite, but also GMB. Very big unions. I think Unite, just short of 1 million members. GMB, about 250,000 members. Very large unions. Keir Starmer, nowhere to be seen. They pay subs to the Labour Party. They pay millions of pounds a year to the Labour Party. Starmer's not there. Nigel Farage is. Farage said this: whilst the government dithers and delays, we've produced a plan to ensure the survival of British steel. Without immediate action to nationalise Jinye's UK business within the next 3 days, the UK's last blast furnaces risk being shut down permanently. The UK's steel industry is broken. Reform UK will fix it. Utterly extraordinary. Utterly extraordinary. You've had Richard Tice talk about nationalising Britain's water companies. By the way, we should do that. Now you've got Nigel Farage talking about the nationalisation of the last steel furnace still operating in this country. Very popular policy, by the way. And even from a purely pragmatic point of view, national security, if you want to go there, absolutely what this country should be doing. Helena, that image of Farage in front of the blast furnace was quite something, wasn't it?
Oh, it absolutely was something. You're absolutely right. When you think about, I mean, the first of all point out, I wonder whether we'll get Joe Coburn describing his as a steel communist. I wonder if we'll get that from the BBC regarding steel nationalisation. But when it comes to the political economy of this, you're absolutely right. It's the key reform target demographic, people who've been hit by the sharp end of deindustrialisation, right? These post-industrial communities where Reform UK are strongest. And at a gap left by the Labour Party, they've swooped in. Farage doesn't believe in nationalisation. He doesn't believe in the state's role in the economy. He's a born-again Thatcherite who praised Liz Truss as finally delivering a proper Conservative budget. But he is smart enough and savvy enough to realise when it is worth giving up your ideological precepts for political power, especially at such a low cost. And when the Labour Party have been sitting their hands on this at a time of geopolitical tension where we should be having someone engaging in radical politics who is ready to grasp the nettle and take actual difficult decisions for the interests of the country, for geopolitical strategic purposes, for making sure we have that level of stability and we protect the interests of both domestic workers and our own supply chains for what's going to be necessary in the changing world ahead. The fact that our current Prime Minister has muted these things, the New Economics Foundation, which is a think tank, a left-wing think tank that is closely allied to Labour Party and Labour Party members, they have multiple MPs sitting on the government's benches today. Miato Fanbele and Jeevan Sandhu were both people who worked for the New Economics Foundation. They were calling for the nationalisation of the steel industry in 2019. The NEF were, and yet the Labour Party, throughout the entirety of the time where Keir Starmer has been in charge, who has essentially tried to market himself as winning back the working classes of post-industrial Britain, right? Being the person who would usurp Jeremy Corbyn, who only appealed to people who lived in the woke Islington and elites kind of bubble, as the right wing would call it, when there was clear mandate under the previous Labour leadership when they were trying to be radical to move towards this kind of industrial policy. And Keir Starmer is doing the opposite, sitting on his hands, whilst people who know that this is the right thing to do have been calling for this for ages. And they have sat on their hands so far that they allowed Reform UK to be able to sweep up and gain the political impetus from what should be a very, very, very easy decision for this government to nationalise British Steel. It's insane to me. And the second of all is that I would like to point out too, this is also Green Party policy. Nationalisation of the steel industry has been Green Party policy for a while now, especially considering that they wanted to do this in Wales. It's been talked about, they had press releases, but have they taken the time or had the effort to go out and have a press conference from Port Talbot or from Scunthorpe talking about their own policy? They haven't. They've been writing press releases that nobody reads and having it in the bottom of the manifesto without telling people about it. And as a Green Party member, I'm infuriated that we haven't been able to put this front and centre and speak to people's interests, and then Reform UK have been able to steal the limelight, if you pardon the pun. It's incredibly frustrating. We really do need some radical politics at this point in time. I was watching a debate on BBC Politics Live yesterday, and there was Chris Curtis, who is the co-chair of the Labour Growth Group and an MP in Milton Keynes. Someone used to be a pollster for Opinion, by the way. She got shut out. She got gifted his seat because a trade unionist who unionised her workplace got shut out, by the way. And in this discussion, Faisal was making the very clear point that now is the time for expansionary policy. Now is the time for the state to take a really active role and really properly put money into British industries or even just British jobs. It doesn't have to be goods and manufacturing. It can be services to be able to increase the graduate premium that's been starved in this country for so long. John Murdoch from the FT has talked about the collapse of the graduate premium in this country because we haven't had large scales of investment. Now would be the time to really take that mantle on. And in response from the co-chair of the Labour Growth Group, the people who are supposed to be there to look at how we can maintain and create loads of growth in this country, it was the one saying, oh no, we can't raise the debt to GDP ratio. What about the fiscal rules? He's living in this deranged Reinhard Rogoff world where you can't have a debt to GDP ratio over 90. You look at Japan, their debt to GDP ratio is 250%. Have they had an economic collapse? No. At a time when now is the time to be looking at how we can use the role of the state to transform our economy. Mariana Mazzucato talked about this a lot in both the entrepreneurial state and in Mission Economy. You spoke to the Unite official there, talking about it being a moonshot towards how we want to engage in the green economy. That's the whole point of the Mission Economy, which Keir Starmer seemed to have only read the blurb of in the run-up to the election, but we need to have some missions. No, it's about having the whole country working together through a proper industrial strategy, through proper strategic thinking and meeting those goals throughout the entire economy working together. And we don't have any strategic thinking Which first it's more Krangos, then it's incinerate the Krangos. Like first it is have an industrial strategy, and now it's all, well, what about the fiscal rules? They have no idea what they're doing, running around like headless chickens, and they're allowing people who actually have an idea of how they want to govern the country and how to win people over, being able to pull the rug from underneath them. I don't know what this government is doing, and at the moment it seems all they want to do is be able to have opportunities to talk about how Keir Starmer is being the leader of the free world and a statesman in negotiation, rather than actually grasping the nettle where it should be and look at how we transform our economy to make it work for working people again. I'm at my wit's end.
Yeah, the point about the growth group is really interesting, right? We want growth, unless it's this thing which looks a bit like social democracy, in which case we don't want it. Well, do you want growth or do you not want growth? Well, we want growth, which basically means neoliberal policies. Okay, but they're not generating growth. They've not generated growth for 15 plus years. Well, gee, I don't know. I haven't really thought about it because, by the way, they haven't. They haven't. And I'll give Donald Trump this. I don't agree with these particular policies. I don't agree with this policy agenda. I think there's a place for tariffs, particularly for poorer economies, by the way. But I'll give him his dues in this respect. He's doing something. He's actually doing something. One of the reasons, in my view, why people like Reeves, Starmer, etc., don't do things like nationalisation, expansionary policy, it's a risk. You do something. Liz Truss, she did something. It was wild and insane. Didn't work. Completely political, miscalculation galore. But she did something. Most of them, particularly, by the way, on the centre-left, but it's a centrist kind of political tendency. You don't do anything. Don't do anything. Don't give working people a better deal. Don't try and reinvigorate British manufacturing. You say that, of course. You say it, but don't do anything. Don't do anything. Just wait. Just wait next year, the year after that, see out your parliamentary term, and then go get some fake job with the WTO or some consultancy, right? Get on the after dinner speaking circuit. That's the point of politics. That's the point of political life in this country. It's not to solve problems. It's to talk about ambition and a new golden age, but it's just that. It's talk. Don't do anything. Don't you dare. And that's why the whole debt to GDP thing is so useful, because it means I can't do anything. In fact, I would even go further. I'd say these tariffs are a blessing for people like Rachel Reeves. The economy goes nowhere. Living standards stagnate. Well, what could we have done? What could we have done? There were these tariffs from Donald Trump. We had no way of responding. What could we have done? It was a fool's errand to think we could do anything. Then why do we have politicians? Why do we have politicians? Why do we have elections every 4 years in this country? And then maybe I'll come back to you quickly on that, Helena. Also on the Greens. Where are the Greens? This is so easy. This is so easy. When there's a flood, put on your barber, put on your wellies, go there, look the part, talk about how the clothes you're wearing are made in Britain, and how actually we need to have as much domestically produced goods and services as possible. And we need to have, sustainable supply chains in the 21st century, and talk about how actually a project of social justice and industrial reinvigoration goes hand in hand with caring about the climate and defending ordinary people's living standards. Make that circle obvious to everyone. But instead, only Farage does this. Only Farage does this. Why is this so hard to do? Why is this so hard? Cycle around in your Brompton, say how it's made in the UK. Do it. It's so easy. Great looking bike. Made in this country. Made with UK workers. Great story. Why is it so hard? What am I missing? Helena, what am I missing?
I think that it's a problem of living in a previous political era when the thing that you did to be a career politician, or not even a career politician, I'm not accusing my own leadership of doing, I don't think they are. I think they really are in the business of trying to have positive change for the better. But in the previous paradigm, in the George Osborne era paradigm, remember you mentioning on Novara Live how everyone said that he was supposed to be this genius figure that everyone's supposed to revere when he was actually doing things that were terrible. But he managed to maintain that position by looking sensible, by being what the Starmerites would describe as being the adults in the room. We don't want radicalism. What we want is a safe pair of hands. We want stability, when that is really out of vogue. And I think that a lot of Green Party politics, because it's actually a very old party, people forget how long it's been around, because its political kind of renaissance has been very recent, that I think there's a lot of thinking internally that you have to mimic the old style of what politics used to be like, to be taken seriously as a political party. And that might have been true in the Caroline Lucas era, when she was actually doing that job really well at looking like a serious politician, being this kind of formidable figure. It was immovable in Brand Pavilion. But that era's over. There's no appetite for this. The appetite for this is very, very, very small. And the appetite is for iconoclasts. It is for people to go out there and be brash and to, as I said, grasp the nettle, go out there and make a name for themselves. Like, press conferences is what you want. You want to be doing press conferences. And again, whether they're on site, whether you do what Reform do, just hire out some village hall somewhere, get the press around there and talk about the issue that you want to talk about. Reform UK have been doing this ever since they came onto the scene in 2020. They've been laser focused on being the people who narrativize. The left are terrible at this. They've been terrible at this forever, outside of the small period in 2015 to 2019, where we kind of changed the game in terms of what people discussed in this country. Right, we took a Brexit election, turned it into a social justice election in 2017. Right, but outside of that period, people on the centre left or the third way kind of people, they continually let the right narrativize on what the subjects would be and then react. Especially when it comes to the Labour Party, but also the Greens in opposition as well. Like, you have the scope, you have the room to set what the narrative should be. You just have to be the one who's forcing people to listen to you. And nice articles in the Metro, that's fine, but you have people need to know who you are, know your face, know what you mean, know what you believe. And I would like to make one last point, what you mentioned there about the idea about when you're spending the money, taking risk. Well, the one time where we have the ability to spend more money, engage in this kind of green industrial strategy, making sure supply chains are as short as possible to minimize the emissions that the shipping industry uses, right? Buying British that's an environmentalist policy, to buy British, to keep things British. This is something that we use to minimize the haulage industry, which is very polluting, for example. Now is the time to be able to have that investment, because if the continuation of this trade war harms the American economy, the demand for treasuries is going to be lower, and people are going to want more stable investments. And gilt yields dropped at the announcement of the tariffs, and so there was going to be more fiscal headroom, even under Rachel Reeves's own fiscal rules, which obviously ditch. So the scope to try and attract people to our own bond market in response to US treasuries potentially plummeting off a cliff if Trump's plan comes to fruition, that gives us more room to be able to do that. And we need to speak the language of radicalism and engage in that level of spending to, rather than just give $2 billion to some car manufacturers, which are in strategic areas for the Labour Party politically. Labour heartlands, Ellesmere Port, Coventry, places like that, But where can we get share equity? Where can we build up, rather than just have GB Energy with no employees in Scotland? Why are we not looking at reinvigorating whole areas of the country through state-led investment, whether it's a publicly owned company or whether it's public-private partnerships, whether you're getting share equity schemes in existing companies in response to some level of economic stimulus in those companies too? We could create that kind of economy. But no one wants to think about that. No one wants to think about what that radicalism would look like, because they're stuck in an old paradigm. Both current Green Party politicians and the Starmerites at the top of the party alike.
Yeah, it's really extraordinary. Lots of love for Helena saying you should go work for the Greens. Maybe you should, Helena. That would be probably quite useful, I imagine. Somebody said in the comments as well that, I'm guilty of insincerity by saying that a Green politician should rock up to a flood wearing a barber and wellies and talk about how we need to have more things made in this country and we need to connect domestic supply chains, reindustrialization with the green agenda. I mean, I just disagree. Politics is about storytelling. And if you don't tell a good story, somebody else will, and you're going to lose. We do have, I think, one super chat. Let me see. Bazcam. Always good to see Baz up there with £10. Thank you so much, Baz. And Vegan Barnsley says the Green Party's comms are shocking. If they can't get them across, then we need a new party of the left with the backing of the unions. I kind of have a distinctive view on this. The Green Party went from 1 to 4 MPs with anything but a national campaign. And I think they're going to do the same again. And their ambition, quite understandably, is to go from, say, 4 to 10 or 12 MPs using the same approach, which is basically flying under the radar of national media until the next general election. If they get 10, 12 MPs, great. They're thinking on a timeline of 20, 30 years. That's fine. My response to that would be, you can do both. You can do both. You can have ultra-local campaigning, just like they did in those 3 seats they picked up in July last year. At the same time, you can have a national narrative, setting the agenda, making the debate when it comes to really big policy like should we nationalise Britain's last steel blast furnace, right? I think we should. The Greens think that too. You need to explain that in the national media. Let's go to our next story and a warning that it contains graphic images. Israel has killed another journalist in Gaza as it continues to intensify its genocidal war on the enclave after shattering the ceasefire agreement on the 18th of March. Ahmed Mansour, a correspondent for Palestine Today, was burned alive in an Israeli attack on a media tent in Khan Yunis. We can see his colleagues desperately trying to save him in this harrowing footage. The Israeli airstrike hit the media tent without warning at 3 a.m, according to eyewitness accounts. The media tent targeted in yesterday's attack was outside Nasser Hospital, but Mansour succumbed to his severe burns and died. Another Palestine Today journalist, Hilmi al-Fakawi, and citizen Youssef al-Kazenda were also killed, and at least 8 other journalists were injured, some critically. Ahmed Aziz, a Middle East Eye correspondent who witnessed the strike, said those in the media tent, quote, tried desperately to rescue Ahmed Mansour from the flames, but there were no resources available as the sponge, wood, and nylon in the tent quickly caught fire. Israel has killed at least 230 journalists and media workers since October 2023. That's according to Palestinian Journalists Syndicate. That's more than the combined total of journalists killed in World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Yugoslavian Civil War, and the war in Afghanistan. In other words, Israel's genocidal war on Gaza is the deadliest ever conflict for journalists. Gaza is also the deadliest place for aid workers and the most dangerous place to be a child. Israel has killed or injured at least 100 children every single day since resuming its carpet bombing of Gaza, according to UNICEF. UNRWA Commissioner General Philippe Lazzarini posted this on X. Harrowing. At least 100 children reported killed or injured every day in Gaza since the strikes resumed, according to UNICEF. Young lives cut short in a war not of children's making. Since the war began 1.5 years ago, 15,000 children were reportedly killed. The ceasefire at the beginning of the year gave Gaza's children a chance to survive and be children. The resumption of the war is again robbing them of their childhood. The war has turned Gaza into a no land for children. This is a stain on our common humanity. Nothing justifies the killing of children wherever they are. Resume the ceasefire now. And let's be clear. Israel's campaign of genocide and ethnic cleansing over the past 15 months is a war on children. Children under 18 made up 43% of the population of Palestine. And Israel has killed at least 15,000 children in Gaza over the past 15 months. Probably, in fact, it's more than that. In the last week alone, Israel bombed 3 schools sheltering displaced people. Helena, that statistic I said a few moments ago about journalists, more journalists and media workers dying in this conflict than World War I and II and the Korean War and the Afghan War and Vietnam. I mean, that is truly, truly mind-bending, isn't it?
It is mind-bending, and it serves a very specific purpose because, of course, unlike a lot of wars where allies are ones who back each other up regardless, Israel knows that it has to toe a line around its Western allies because it is breaking a bunch of the conventions that the West has set up. As we've mentioned loads of times about the international liberal rules-based order, obviously a lot of this is just smoke and mirrors internationally because it only really applied for countries in the global south and is obviously currently not applying to Israel. But at the very least in Western democracies, they're still beholden a lot to their own population. And Israel still has to be able to broadcast its image of itself as being like the West. Or, well, we do obey these things, even if internally a lot of these Western countries don't do this. You look at Abu Ghraib and places like that. You know, there's always been plenty of times where Western democracies have been able to get away with this kind of the violation of the international rules-based order and war crimes and crimes against humanity, just like Israel is carrying out in Gaza at this point in time. But to be able to maintain its image as the only democracy in the Middle East, it can't let people see what it's done. It can't let people engage with the fact that it lives in a kind of era of world building, of nation building from the early 1900s, which doesn't exist amongst Western countries today. This is why we're seeing a fall in support for Israel more broadly, because it's now more open about the fact that it is happy with colonization. It is happy with land grabs. It is happy with ethno-nationalism in a way that a lot of Western democracies haven't been particularly amenable to, especially in the last 50 years or so. So it has to be able to protect its own image as being like the West, which it can't do if journalists on the ground are reporting the war crimes that they do completely unfiltered. It has to go through the filter of how Western journalists report on the crimes on the ground, with levels of plausible deniability. Oh, well, the footage appears to contradict the Israeli narrative, but as we've seen from people like in the House of Commons saying, well, we need to make sure that Israel investigates itself, and just as it always does, it'll find out, well, actually, we did nothing wrong, or it was all a mistake. And then 15 years later, they'll be like, well, actually, it was us, like they did with Shireen Abu Akleh, where it took them forever to admit that they were the ones doing the wrongdoing. And it was only after continued reporting proved that they were lying that they then climbed down, but by then everybody had forgotten. So we went through all of the 5 stages of denial with regards to, it wasn't us, well, it was us, but they were really Hamas terrorists, well, it was us, but it was an accident, and then, well, actually, we did it deliberately, So they have to eliminate the reporting on the ground that proves them wrong, the reporting on the ground that people cannot ignore, that disproves the lies, that provides the counter narrative that actually Israel doesn't have the interests of humanity at large in its heart when it does these things, when it engaged in its war crime, its campaign of ethnic cleansing, of colonization and genocide. It is not in the only democracy in the Middle East because it's an apartheid state where the people who it colonizes do not get access to the same level of democratic and internal level of human rights that the ethno-nationalist population do in the area. So it cannot maintain this veil of humanity that has been provided to it for so long, when reporters on the ground just show you the footage of what they do when they get access to Gaza and what they have done. And they now are so emboldened by the Trump administration, they have even more impunity to be able to do that and continue to do that.
Yeah, we talked about this last night in a conversation I had with Ilan Pappé. He made a really powerful point, which is the reason why you have a manipulation, really, of the historical memory of the Holocaust and the permanent accusations of anti-Semitism to basically anybody that criticizes Israel is precisely because what is happening is so contrary to human instincts. It is so contrary to human instincts. I asked him, how is it possible that Israelis are moving further to the right, more supportive of this project of settler colonial expansionism, as they're seeing on their phones thousands of people being killed, including at least 15,000 children. How is it possible that the more exposed they get to this, the more radical they become in terms of this annihilationist instinct? And he talks, well, if the indoctrination you've been subject to since childhood is that if you don't do this, there'll be a second Holocaust, then it makes perfect sense. You will want to watch that whole conversation. Really extraordinary conversation. It'll be up in the next few weeks on our YouTube channel. Downstream goes up every Sunday. It'll be there on one Sunday at 3 p.m. Not this week, probably the week after. You will not want to miss it. Truly extraordinary conversation. Back on this story tonight, in some of the first testimonies from IDF soldiers collected since Israel's genocidal war on Gaza began, military personnel have described raising huge swathes of the occupied territory with armored bulldozers and manually laid explosives. They transformed the area into a, quote, kill zone where anyone who entered was a target. These testimonies were gathered by Israeli Veterans Watchdog Project, Breaking the Silence, and collated in a report called The Perimeter. According to the report, IDF soldiers were ordered to create, quote, a death zone of enormous proportions and deliberately, methodically, and systematically annihilate anything in the perimeter. This included entire residential neighborhoods, schools, mosques, and even cemeteries. Before October 2023, Israel had already created a 300-meter buffer zone inside Gaza. The new kill zone ranges from 800 to 1,500 meters, according to military testimony. It accounts for 15% of the whole of Gaza and 35% of the occupied territory's agricultural land. This was fertile farmland that sustained the lives and livelihoods of generations of Palestinians, and Israel has utterly destroyed it. Just as a side note, remember that Israel's war on Gaza is an ecological disaster as well as a human genocide. One sergeant in the Combat Engineers Corps told The Guardian that once an area in the perimeter was, quote, pretty much empty of Gazans, they were told to blow up homes or what was left of homes. The Israeli sergeant said this about their daily routine on the kill zone. Get up in the morning, each platoon gets 5, 6, or 7 locations, 7 houses that they're supposed to work on. We didn't know a lot about the places that we were destroying or why we were doing it. I guess those things today, from my perspective now, are not legitimate. What I saw there, as far as I can judge, was beyond what I can justify that was needed. Just clearly ethnic cleansing, open and shut. Now, multiple soldiers were told they needed to expand the buffer zone to prevent another border attack, but experts have expressed doubt that Israel's actions can be justified under international humanitarian law. Beyond this, a widespread destruction of civilian property without a clear military necessity is a war crime. Amnesty International and other humanitarian organizations have already called for the significant expansion of the buffer or kill zone to be investigated as the war crimes of wanton destruction and of collective punishment. Helena, like I say, it does seem very much like an open and shut case of ethnic cleansing. And again, to return to that conversation I had last night with Ilan Pape, ethnic cleansing is that first necessary step to the genocide we're now seeing. How can anyone with eyes and ears, with any kind of empirical mindset, refute what is going on here? I mean, these are the literal words of IDF veterans involved in these actions.
I mean, you only have to listen to the statements made by Israel Katz when he was literally talking, well, if Hamas don't surrender, then we will keep stealing land. There was words directly from Israel Katz about their plans for stealing Gaza and shrinking the size of the enclave, right? Eilon Levy was on his social media platform talking about how the Green Line doesn't exist. It's just an armistice line from 1967. There is no Palestinian state, and therefore these things are negotiable, and we'll keep pushing and pushing. Like, there's been very clear from people both inside the government, outside the government, related to the government in Israel. You have links to the Likud party or some of the even more radical elements of the governmental coalition, that their whole plan is colonization. And this is textbook colonization. Not only do you have to get rid of the people, you have to wipe out the memory that they were ever there in the first place. Every single part of their history and culture, everything that they've ever built and created and curated in the area, burnt to cinders, destroyed completely and razed to the ground so that they can, again, formulate the Trump plan. Netanyahu was incredibly clear. He said, we are engaging in the Trump plan. We are cleaning out Gaza. We're going to create the Riviera of the Middle East. They've been how many times do Israeli officials have to say the quiet part out loud, right? Back in 2023, Avi Dichter said, we are rolling out the Gaza Nakba, i.e. the coming back to finish off what they started in 1948 with the ethnic cleansing of Palestine by expanding into Judea and Samaria, which is part of the Likud party charter, the governing party in Israel. They currently have as part of their founding charter that they have a divine right to all of this area and that should be part of the ethno-state of Israel. It's very clear in terms of everything they believe, every part of their ideology, and the statements of these people ever since the start of the conflict, and of course, even before, throughout the continual Israel-Palestine conflict, that this is their end goal, and they now have a chance to be able to complete it because no one holds them accountable for it. It's an open and shut case. It's an open and shut case. We have all of the things. We have motive, we have opportunity, we have opportunity, and we have people confessing to the crime. It's open and shut.
Yeah. I mean, I still find it crazy. I'll see somebody on social media, I saw Ben Goldsmith, the brother of Zach Goldsmith, talk about how unhinged supporters of Gaza, but you don't have to support Gaza or Palestine to think it's bad to kill 15,000 children. You don't have to support anything. You say, this is bad, it should stop happening. That's a very common sense position. And I'm thinking, you've got kids. Not that that matters, of course, but you've got kids. How on earth do you excuse 15,000 children being killed? How? I can understand to some extent with Israeli civil society because of the national brainwashing and state-sanctioned forgetting with things like 1948 and the Nakba. I get it with them. Explain it for a British guy, a pro-Israeli, pro-Zionist British guy who has children, who's effectively saying, oh, no big deal, 15,000 kids being killed. How does that happen? How does that happen? I find that in many ways more troubling than what's going on with Israeli civil society. That's at least explicable, right? Mass indoctrination, mass brainwashing. I guess with somebody like Ben Goldsmith, you're thinking, well, there's the Israel lobby, they shape the debate in this country, et cetera, et cetera. You can't compare the two though, can you? Really? I don't think you can anyway. Helena, thanks for joining me this evening. Great show.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Aaron, as always.
And thanks everyone for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live show at 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.